5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Start. The concept of a ceasefire is foundational to international peace and security. It represents a mutual agreement between conflicting parties to halt hostilities, often with the intention of de-escalating a conflict or creating a window for peaceful negotiations. However, violations of ceasefire agreements have long been a source of tension in global conflicts. These breaches undermine the very essence of trust, disrupt peace processes, and, in many cases, reignite violence. The notion that ceasefire violations should be treated as an attempt to war is rooted in the principle that when a party disregards a formal agreement to halt hostilities, they are not merely breaking a temporary truce but actively undermining the potential for peace and stability. This argument calls for a re-evaluation of how such violations are treated and suggests that they should be viewed with the same seriousness as an overt act of aggression. A ceasefire is not just a temporary break in fighting, it is an essential component of any conflict resolution process. It is meant to give parties the chance to de-escalate tensions, provide humanitarian relief, and create space for dialogue. The terms of a ceasefire are typically negotiated and agreed upon by both sides, often with international mediators acting as witnesses or guarantors. The violation of these terms disrupts the process of negotiation and can quickly escalate a fragile situation back into full-scale conflict. For many nations or groups in conflict, the violation of a ceasefire is not a mere tactical move, it can signal an intention to resume or escalate violence. Ceasefires are not open-ended agreements, but are instead a step toward a larger peace process. When one side breaks this agreement, it undermines the possibility of a peaceful resolution and shifts the dynamic toward an inevitable return to hostilities. This breach signals a lack of commitment to peace and a willingness to use force to settle differences. As a result, a ceasefire violation can be seen as a deliberate attempt to reignite the war. Ceasefires, by their very nature, require a significant amount of trust between the parties involved. Each side must believe that the other is committed to halting violence for the sake of a broader peace agreement. A violation of this trust can have severe repercussions, not just for the immediate parties but for the broader international community. The violation of a ceasefire signals a breakdown in the process of diplomacy and sets a dangerous precedent that any future agreements may be disregarded. When one side violates a ceasefire, the other side is often forced into a position where it must either retaliate or absorb the breach without response. If the violation is not met with consequences, it emboldens the aggressor and invites further violations. If retaliation is chosen, the conflict intensifies and the window for diplomacy closes. This vicious cycle can quickly escalate into a full-scale war, causing loss of life, destruction, and instability that could have been avoided had the ceasefire been respected. The very act of breaking a ceasefire is an attempt to destabilize the process of peace building and provoke the other party into a violent response. Such actions are not incidental, They are calculated risks meant to force the other side back into a position where war becomes the only viable option. Therefore, when a ceasefire is violated, it can be considered not just a breach of protocol but a calculated step toward the resumption of war. International law recognizes the importance of ceasefires in maintaining global peace and security. Treaties and conventions, such as the Geneva Conventions, regulate the conduct of war and emphasize the significance of ceasefire agreements, which are often legally binding. Violating such agreements is a direct contravention of international law and the principles of peace and security. In this sense, a breach of ceasefire terms can be seen as a violation of the moral and legal framework that governs relations between states or groups. When a ceasefire is violated, it is not merely an isolated act of hostility but a deliberate challenge to the international order. It suggests that the violator no longer considers themselves bound by the rules of engagement or the broader principles of international peace. If ceasefire violations were treated as attempts to wage war, it would send a clear message to the international community that such behavior will not be tolerated. Holding violators accountable in this way could deter future breaches and reinforce the importance of adhering to agreements in the pursuit of peace. The moral argument for treating ceasefire violations as acts of war is also compelling. A ceasefire represents a collective effort to reduce suffering and protect human lives. Violating this agreement disregards the lives of innocent people who depend on the cessation of violence for their safety. Moreover, such violations disrupt humanitarian efforts, including the delivery of food, medicine, and aid to vulnerable populations. By treating ceasefire violations as attempts to restart conflict, the international community can make a stronger moral stand against actions that prioritize power struggles over human welfare. If ceasefire violations were universally recognized as an attempt to reignite war, it would have significant diplomatic and political implications. First, it would increase the pressure on violators to honor their commitments and refrain from using force to achieve their goals. When ceasefire violations are treated lightly or ignored, it sends a message that the international community is willing to tolerate breaches of peace, weakening the global commitment to resolving conflicts through nonviolent means. Conversely, treating ceasefire violations as attempts to resume war would have a number of deterrent effects. Violators would be aware that such actions would provoke international condemnation, increase the likelihood of economic sanctions, and invite more robust diplomatic efforts to hold them accountable. Such a shift in how ceasefire violations are perceived could also help deter the emergence of conflicts in the first place. The understanding that breaching a ceasefire could lead to war would encourage parties to negotiate more earnestly and make compromises in the pursuit of peace. Stop.